Her mother had rehearsed her for this moment for 20 years. It lasted less than a minute. The lessons had been simple, etched into her soul with the corrosive acid of repetition. Smile, agree, defer, be pleasing, be porcelain, be a beautiful, silent asset. Aurelia Beaumont stood at the altar, the scent of old stone and wilting lilies filling her lungs, and felt the 20 years of careful construction begin to crack. Beside her, the Duke of Blackwood was a monolith of stillness, a man she had met precisely 3 times, each meeting a masterpiece of stilted formality. Lady Beaumont, a viper in watered silk, leaned in from the front pew, her whisper a dry hiss that scraped against Aurelia's ear. Smile and say nothing. He is a duke. Your part is to be grateful. It was the final instruction, the culmination of a lifetime of coaching designed to secure this very prize. A ruined family, a mountain of debt, and a single, marriageable daughter. Her future felt like a page in a ledger, already filled in with ink she had no hand in mixing. Aurelia looked at the man she was about to bind herself to, Alistair, Duke of Blackwood. He was older, perhaps by a dozen years, with a face that seemed carved from granite and patience. He was not handsome in the way of the young dandies at court, but there was a severe, undeniable power in his posture, in the steady calm of his gaze. She had noticed in their brief encounters that the tips of his fingers on his right hand were perpetually stained with ink, a small, human imperfection on an otherwise formidable figure. He looked at her now, his expression unreadable, waiting. The bishop cleared his throat, his voice echoing in the cavernous chapel. The words washed over her, a tide of tradition pulling her toward a shore she did not want to reach. He would ask her to consent, and she was to whisper "I do," and the transaction would be complete. Her mother's face was a mask of triumphant anxiety. The whispers of the gathered society were a low hum, the sound of bees in a distant clover field. They were all waiting for the performance. The moment arrived. The bishop's gaze fell upon her. "Do you, Aurelia?" She did not smile. She did not look at her mother. She turned her head fully and met the Duke's moss-green eyes. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The hum of the crowd faded. The weight of the lilies vanished. There was only his stillness and the frantic, rebellious hammering of her own heart. She drew a breath, the first one that felt truly her own all day. Her voice, when it came, was not the coached, airy whisper she was meant to produce. It was low, clear, and steady, a sound of such profound and sudden authenticity that a collective gasp rippled through the pews. "Your Grace," she began, addressing him directly, ignoring the sputtering bishop. "Before I answer, you must understand the nature of my consent. I will not be a possession. I will not be a decorative fixture in your home, seen but not heard. I will be a partner, with a voice in my own life, or I will be nothing to you at all. The woman my mother has sold you is a fiction. I am not her." She paused, her heart a wild bird against her ribs. "Do you still consent?" A horrified silence descended upon the chapel. It was absolute, profound, a vacuum where propriety had once been. Her mother looked as though she had been struck by lightning. The bishop's mouth hung open, a perfect, shocked oval. But Aurelia's eyes never left the Duke's. She saw not anger, but a flicker of something utterly unexpected. Surprise, yes, but also intrigue. A sharpening of his focus, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He held her gaze for a long moment, the stained fingers of his hand twitching almost imperceptibly at his side. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight. Then, a slow, deliberate nod. His own voice was a low baritone, cutting through the tension with effortless authority. He did not look at the bishop. He looked only at her. "I do." The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a silence thick with unspoken words. Aurelia sat opposite the Duke in his perfectly sprung carriage, the rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves the only sound between them. She expected recrimination, a cold lecture on her duties, or at the very least, a demand for an explanation. She received none of it. He simply sat, his long frame folded into the corner, and watched the rolling hills of his domain pass by the window. She studied him from beneath her lashes, the severe line of his jaw, the dark hair just beginning to show threads of silver at the temples. He was not a man who betrayed his thoughts easily. His placid exterior was a fortress, yet she had breached its walls, however briefly. The memory of his focused gaze, the quiet intensity of his I do, sent a shiver through her that was not entirely fear. It was the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of having stepped off a cliff and not yet begun to fall. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape like a second cliff, a sprawling edifice of grey stone and mullioned windows that seemed to glower down at the manicured gardens. It was immense, imposing, and utterly without warmth. As they stepped from the carriage, a line of servants stood waiting, their faces as impassive as their masters. An older woman with a ramrod-straight spine and hair pinned in a severe bun stepped forward. "Your Grace, welcome home." Her eyes flickered to Aurelia, a quick, assessing glance. "Mrs. Gable," the Duke acknowledged with a nod. "This is the Duchess. See to her needs." It was a statement of fact, delivered without inflection. He then turned to Aurelia. "Dinner is at 8. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. I have work to attend to." And with that, he was gone, striding down a long, echoing corridor, his footsteps swallowed by the vastness of the house. Aurelia was left with the housekeeper, feeling like a parcel that had just been delivered. Mrs. Gable led her up a grand, curving staircase, their footsteps the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The silence pressed down like a velvet shroud, heavy and suffocating. Her apartments were magnificent. A sitting room, a bedroom, a dressing room, all furnished with heavy dark wood and rich brocades. It was the pinnacle of taste and luxury, and it felt as personal as a hotel. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no hint of the man who owned it all. It was a beautiful, gilded cage. That evening, dinner was an exercise in excruciating formality. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 30, the distance between them a vast, polished chasm. Servants moved like ghosts, placing and removing dishes. The Duke ate with a focused economy of motion, his attention seemingly on his plate. Aurelia, however, watched him. She watched the way his ink-stained fingers held his wine glass, the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes. He finally broke the silence as the dessert plates were cleared. "Your declaration. In the chapel." It was unexpected. Aurelia placed her fork down carefully. "I imagine it was." "My solicitors assured me the terms of the marriage contract were most agreeable to your family," he said, his tone neutral. "The terms were agreeable to my mother, Your Grace," she corrected him softly. "She was the one selling the goods. I felt the buyer should be aware of their true nature. A flicker of something. Amusement? Respect?" crossed his face before it was gone. "I see. And what is their true nature?" "I am not porcelain," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not shatter if handled without ceremony, and I will not be a silent partner in my own life." He considered this, leaning back in his chair. "An admirable sentiment, Duchess. We shall see how it fares within these walls." The words were not a threat, but a statement of fact. The house itself felt like a challenge. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. The Duke was a creature of habit. He rose early, spent his days locked in his study, and emerged only for meals. He was polite, distant, and utterly impenetrable. He treated her with the formal courtesy one might afford a visiting dignitary. He was her husband in name, but in reality, they were strangers sharing a cavernous museum. Aurelia, left to her own devices, began to explore. The house was a labyrinth of rooms, most of them shrouded in dust covers, frozen in time. But it was the library that drew her. It was a magnificent 2-story room, filled from floor to ceiling with books on every conceivable subject. It was the one room in the house that felt alive, that hummed with the energy of thought and knowledge. And it was here she found the first true crack in the Duke's armor. She had been perusing a section on botany, her one private passion, a small rebellion cultivated in the back pages of borrowed books. She was tracing the delicate illustration of a night blooming cereus when she noticed a volume left on a reading table. It was a rare, privately printed treatise on the orchids of the West Indies. A book she had only ever dreamed of seeing. It was open to a page detailing a particularly elusive specimen, the ghost orchid. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he had left it there for her. There was no note, no indication, but it was a deliberate act. It was a gesture made in silence, a single, quiet word in their conversation of voids and distances. She ran her fingers over the page, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was the first kindness she had received in this cold grey house, the first sign that the man behind the ducal mask was watching, and perhaps even listening. A month into their strange, sterile marriage, a letter arrived bearing her mother's frantic, looping script. Aurelia recognized the seal instantly, and a familiar dread coiled in her stomach. She took the letter from the salver before the butler could deliver it to the Duke's study, retreating to the solitude of her sitting room to read it. It was exactly as she had anticipated, a torrent of veiled accusations, pleas for understanding, and, at its heart, a desperate, grasping request for funds. A new creditor had emerged, one her mother had conveniently forgotten to mention during the marriage negotiations. The letter was designed to be read by the Duke, a pathetic appeal to his honor and his duty to his new wife's family. It was a continuation of the transaction, another invoice for the goods delivered. Aurelia read it twice, the vellum crinkling in her tightening grip. The old Aurelia would have wept. The old Aurelia would have dutifully passed it along to her husband, her face a mask of shame and apology, playing her part as the burdensome bride. But the woman who had spoken at the altar was not that girl. She walked to the fireplace, the unlit logs a somber pyre, and held the letter over the grate. For a long moment she simply stood there, then resolutely she set it down on the mantel. Burning it felt too much like hiding. This required a direct response. She spent the next hour at the small secretaire in her room, composing a reply. Her own handwriting was neat and precise, a stark contrast to her mother's emotional sprawl. She was polite but firm. She expressed her regret at their situation, but stated in no uncertain terms that the financial obligations of the Beaumont family were no longer the concern of the Duke of Blackwood. She enclosed a small amount of her own pin money. A pittance, really, but a symbolic gesture. It was a payment to end the transaction, not continue it. "This is the last," the gesture said. "We are done." That evening at dinner, she waited until the servants had withdrawn before she spoke. "I received a letter from my mother today," she said, her voice even. The Duke looked up from his soup, his green eyes watchful. Indeed, she wrote of some new financial difficulty. "The letter was intended for you, but I took the liberty of answering it myself." She watched his face for any reaction, but it remained a placid mask. "And what was your answer?" he asked, his tone betraying nothing. "I informed her that my husband's generosity has its limits, and that she has reached them," Aurelia stated calmly. "I sent her a small sum of my own, and made it clear that any future such appeals would go unanswered. I will not have my family become a permanent drain on your resources, Your Grace. My shame is not for sale, and neither is your patronage." He set his spoon down, the small clink of silver on porcelain loud in the quiet room. He He studied her, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were dissecting her very thoughts. She met it without flinching, her resolve a steel rod in her spine. This was a test. This was her drawing a line in the sand, not just for her mother, but for him. It was an act of protection, not just for his coffers, but for the fragile, undefined space that was their marriage. She was protecting it from the taint of her past. "You took it upon yourself to manage this," he said finally. "It was not a question." "They are my family," she replied. "It is my responsibility to see that they do not impose upon my husband. That is the role of a partner, is it not?" She threw his own word back at him, the one he had so coolly acknowledged after her stunt in the chapel. A long silence followed. Aurelia's heart hammered, but she kept her hands steady in her lap. This was the moment he would either retreat further behind his walls, incensed at her audacity, or he would see the act for what it was, a declaration of allegiance. "Yes, Duchess," he said at last, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I suppose it is." He picked up his spoon and resumed his meal, but something had shifted. The air between them, while still vast, felt clearer, as if a fog had begun to lift. He had seen her strength, and he had not been displeased. Her small victory emboldened her. Aurelia began to cautiously assert herself within the cold stone walls of Blackwood Manor. She started with the gardens. They were extensive but neglected, a riot of overgrown roses and choked flower beds. With the hesitant approval of the head gardener, a man who seemed perpetually surprised to be spoken to by the Duchess, she began to work. She sketched out new plans, ordered seeds, and spent hours with her hands in the soil, feeling the earth beneath her fingernails like a balm to her soul. The Duke would sometimes watch her from his study window. She was aware of his gaze, a silent, observing presence. He never commented on her work, but one afternoon, she found a collection of old, leather-bound botanical manuals on the library table, their pages filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes from what must have been his grandmother. It was another quiet gesture, another book left for her to find. His words were like careful little stones laid out to build a wall, but his actions were beginning to feel like windows. Her curiosity about him, the man behind the title, grew into a quiet obsession. She learned from Mrs. Gable that the west wing of the manor had been closed off for years, ever since the death of the first Duchess of Blackwood. The housekeeper spoke the words in a hushed, reverent tone, as if the very air in that part of the house were sacred and sorrowful. She was a fragile creature, Your Grace, Mrs. Gable had explained, her hands smoothing her apron. Like a hothouse flower. The Duke, he was never the same after she was gone. A fragile flower. The phrase snagged in Aurelia's mind. She thought of the pressed ghost orchid in the book he had left for her. Pale, beautiful, and lifeless. Was that what he had wanted? A replacement flower to press between the pages of his life? The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the drafty corridors of the manor. One evening, a storm broke over the estate, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain against the ancient stone. The Duke did not appear for dinner. After waiting for an hour, a strange disquiet settled over Aurelia. It was not her place to intrude, but the oppressive atmosphere of the house, amplified by the storm, pushed her into motion. She took a candelabra and went in search of him. She found him not in his study, but in the library. He was standing before the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. He did not seem to notice her arrival. The room was dark save for the firelight, which cast dancing shadows across his face, carving deep lines of sorrow into his usually impassive features. On the mantelpiece, propped against a marble clock, was a small, exquisite portrait miniature. A woman with ethereal, pale beauty and large, sad eyes. Aurelia stopped just inside the doorway, the candlelight flickering in her hand. "Your Grace?" she said softly. He started, turning from the fire. His eyes, when they met hers, were unguarded for the first time. She saw in them a depth of grief so profound it was like looking into a well. He seemed to debate for a moment, his internal walls rising, then falling with a sigh of resignation. "My wife," he said, his voice rough. He gestured with his glass toward the miniature. "Elara, the first Duchess of Blackwood." Aurelia stepped further into the room, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp empathy. "Mrs. Gable told me. I am sorry for your loss." A humorless laugh escaped him. "People are always sorry. It changes nothing." He took a long swallow of brandy. "She was everything to me. And I killed her." The words hung in the air, more shocking than the crack of thunder outside. Aurelia stared at him, her mind reeling. "What do you mean?" "Not with my own hands," he clarified, his voice laced with self-loathing. "With my love. It was too much, too possessive, too demanding. She was delicate, and my passion, it smothered her. She retreated into illness, and from there, into death. The doctors called it a wasting sickness. I knew it for what it was. She simply faded, to escape me." He finally looked at Aurelia, his gaze raw and stripped of all artifice. "That is why I chose you," he confessed, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "I read the reports from my solicitors. You were described as biddable, quiet, unassuming. You were meant to be the opposite of Elara. You were meant to be safe. A marriage of convenience, a duchess to manage my home, an heir to secure the line. No passion, no danger. A quiet, orderly arrangement where no one could get hurt." He gestured around the vast, silent library. "I built this mausoleum for myself, and I intended to find a placid ghost to haunt it with me. And then you stood at the altar, and you spoke. And you were not a ghost at all." The confession left Aurelia breathless. It explained everything. The distance, the formality, the coldness of the house. It was not a rejection of her. It was a prison he had built for his own grief. She was not his wife. She was his penance. He had married her not for who she was, but for who he thought she was not. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it was clarifying. It was the key to the last locked door. She looked from his tormented face to the delicate, sad-eyed woman in the portrait. She thought of the ghost orchid, a beautiful parasite that clings to a host tree, unable to survive on its own. He had loved a ghost, and now he was trying to live with one. But she, Aurelia, was not a ghost. She was flesh and blood, with hands that knew the feel of soil and a voice that knew how to speak its own mind. A quiet resolve settled over her. She would not be the cure for his grief, nor would she be its casualty. She would not compete with a memory. She set her candelabra down on a nearby table, the small flame a defiant spark in the gloom. "You did not marry a ghost, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "and I will not live in a mausoleum." She left him then, surrounded by the shadows of his past, and went to her rooms. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the storm spend its fury, and she planned. She had leverage now, not of contracts or debts, but of truth. And she would use it to author her own future, with or without him. The next day dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean by the storm. Aurelia rose with a singular purpose. She went not to the gardens, but to the wilder parts of the estate, to the heath that bordered the woods. There she carefully dug up a small, thriving clump of heather, its roots clinging to a ball of dark earth. Heather, she knew, was resilient. It grew on windswept moors, in poor soil, a symbol of fortitude and independence. She returned to the house and went directly to the Duke's study. She did not wait to be announced, knocking once before entering. He was at his desk, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and papers, his ink-stained fingers flying across a page. He looked up, startled as she entered. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. Aurelia walked to his desk and placed the clump of heather directly on top of a neatly stacked pile of documents. Soil crumbled onto the crisp paper. He stared at it, then at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "Last night you told me of the arrangement you intended," she began, her voice calm and measured. "A quiet duchess for a house of memories, a functional, passionless contract. That is the marriage you offered." He said nothing, his jaw tight. "I cannot accept those terms," she continued. "I did not consent to be a caretaker for your grief. I will not spend my life tiptoeing around the memory of your first wife. She deserves her peace, and I deserve a life." She gestured to the heather. "This is me, your grace. Not a pale orchid that needs a hothouse to survive. I am something that grows in the wind and the rain. I can build a life for myself, here with you, or I can build it elsewhere." This was her decisive act, her ultimatum. It was not born of anger, but of a profound and desperate need for honesty. She was laying her own terms on the table, creating a new contract between them. "We can have a true partnership," she said, her voice softening slightly. "One built on what is real, not what is lost. We can let light into this house. We can create a future that is not haunted by the past. Or you can remain here with your ghosts, and I will take my leave. I will not force you to choose, but you must choose." She held his gaze, her entire future hanging in the balance of his decision. He looked from her face, alive with fierce determination, to the hardy sprig of heather, and then his eyes drifted to a corner of his desk, where Aurelia now saw a small, silver frame she hadn't noticed before. It held the pressed ghost orchid, the symbol of his past. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the scratching of his quill, which he still held, poised above the ledger. He was a man caught between two worlds, the suffocating, familiar comfort of his sorrow and the terrifying, brilliant promise of a new beginning. Slowly, deliberately, he set the quill down in its inkwell. He reached out and his fingers, stained with the ink of contracts and accounts, gently touched a purple bell of the heather. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw the walls around his heart crumble into dust. The grief was still there, a shadow in the depths of his eyes, but it was no longer the only thing. There was also a flicker of hope. "Or, Aurelia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. It sounded like a discovery on his lips. He stood, rounding the desk until he was standing before her. He was so tall, so imposing, and yet in that moment he seemed utterly vulnerable. "I have been living in the dark for a very long time," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I did not think the light was something I deserved." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was tentative, questioning. "You are not asking for a contract. You are offering a life." "I am offering our life," she corrected him softly. "If you will have it." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them, the shadows had receded. He took her hand, his larger one enveloping hers. "Stay," he said, the single word a plea and a promise. "Stay and teach me how to live in the sun again." In that moment, a catharsis swept through her, a release of all the tension and fear she had carried since her wedding day. It was not a triumphant victory, but a quiet, profound joining. He leaned in, and his kiss was not the kiss of a duke claiming his duchess, but of a man finding his way home. It was gentle, hesitant, and filled with the unspoken promise of a new chapter, written not in the fading ink of memory, but in the vibrant colors of a future they would choose to build together. A year later, the gardens of Blackwood Manor were a testament to the transformation within its walls. What had been a place of regimented gloom and neglect was now a riot of life and colour. Roses climbed the grey stone, their blossoms like drops of blood and cream against the sombre facade. The air, once heavy with silence, now carried the scent of lavender and the hum of bees. Aurelia stood on the terrace, a basket of cuttings on her arm, directing the gardeners with a quiet confidence that had become second nature to her. The house behind her was no longer a mausoleum. Its windows were thrown open to the sun. Its corridors echoed with the footsteps of a staff that no longer moved like ghosts. It was a home. Alistair came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. He no longer wore the constant severe mask of the Duke. Laughter had softened the lines around his eyes, and his smile, once a rare and fleeting thing, was now readily given, especially to her. He took her hand, his fingers, still faintly ink-stained, lacing through hers, which were smudged with honest dirt. "Another campaign, my dear?" he asked, his eyes twinkling as he looked at the array of plants and plans. "A peaceful one," she assured him. "We are liberating the east wall from its oppressive ivy." He chuckled, a warm, rich sound that she loved. "I have no doubt the ivy will surrender unconditionally." He grew serious for a moment, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I was in the library this morning," he said softly. "I finally packed away Elara's things. The miniature, the books. They are being sent to her sister. It is time." Aurelia felt a surge of love for this man, for his courage in facing down his own ghosts. "Was it difficult?" she asked gently. "It was an ending," he said simply. "And every ending makes way for a new beginning." He turned to her, his expression full of a deep, abiding tenderness. "Speaking of which, I have something for you." He led her not to the formal gardens, but to the glass conservatory she had spent months restoring. Inside, the warm, humid air was thick with the scent of orchids. But these were not the pale, lifeless specimens from his books. They were a vibrant, living collection, their blossoms a riot of colour and shape. In the centre, on a pedestal of its own, was a single magnificent plant. A ghost orchid, its spectral white flowers blooming in the dappled sunlight. It was not pressed and framed. It was alive, its roots clinging to a piece of cork bark, thriving. "It is not a memory," Alistair said, his voice quiet beside her. "It is a promise that beautiful things need not be fragile, that the rarest treasures are the ones that are strong enough to live and grow." Aurelia reached out and touched a delicate petal. It was soft, resilient, and vibrantly alive beneath her fingers. She looked at her husband, the man she had challenged at the altar, the stranger who had become the center of her world. Their beginning had been a quiet rebellion, a refusal to accept a life half-lived, and from that refusal, they had cultivated something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. True partnership was not a contract signed in a church, but a choice made every day to turn toward the sun together.